Thank you very much for inviting me. It's the second year I'm in Leuven. It was almost on the date a year back I was here the first time, and I spoke on that occasion on the theopolitics of ISIS, the theological problems of this fusion between theology and politics that ISIS has enacted. And obviously ISIS didn't listen to my lecture. The evidence of that is twofold. Firstly, I'm still alive, so obviously they didn't listen in. Secondly, ISIS is still there. They haven't disbanded as any rigorous self-assessment of its ideational framework would lead to. So today I'm speaking on a different subject matter. In a sense, I'm speaking a bit earlier in this series. So my intention with today's lecture is twofold. And I apologize, I'm sitting down, although I'm not that old. I know I'm a bit older than you guys, but I'm simply a bit tired. It's my second lecture, having delivered one in Brussels on my way in, and I have to catch a flight back to the UK. So it's really a form of jihad, a form of struggle for me today. So I'll be seated most of the time. My intention with today's lecture is twofold. First, I intend to provide a taxonomy, which is to say a system of classification of the variant forms of political Islam across the Muslim majority world. I'm focusing not only on the Middle East, but the broader Muslim majority world from Morocco to Malaysia and indeed beyond. And in doing so, we want to cover or perhaps uncover different archetypes of the multiple manifestations and even rival discourses on Islam's relation to politics. In the process, we will try to read the intellectual history of political Islam and the political history of Islam, but not in a rectilinear historiography. You would know as MA students that there are two ways of doing history. One is rectilinearity, the Whiggish historiographic tradition, where there's a certain teleology of history. But you can read history in the inverse, noting the enabling conditions and the leaps backwards and forwards, and sometimes in circularity, which is what Foucault instantiated really in the form of the genealogical method of doing history. So if anything, we won't be doing teleology, we would be doing genealogy, but of course I can only give you snippets of each instantiation of political Islam. There are reasons, of course, why this question of Islam's relations to politics is center stage in today's political and academic discourse. First has to do with our brave new age of terror, in which the engagement with the religious other and its politicization and its securitization has become paramount, not only to security concerns, but indeed to self-identity. So terrorism pertains to ontological security as well as to international security. The second reason has to do, and now we're doing a bit of genealogy, the relationship between the Occident and the Orient. Pretty much since the forward march of Islam into Europe from the middle of the 8th century onwards, entering from eastern shores, from western shores, and from the south, from Sicily, from the Iberian Peninsula, from the Balkans, and in the process manifesting a dual challenge to Europe, both a security challenge and an ideational challenge. In the process, this relationship between the Occidental self and the Oriental other conditions the self-identity of the West. After all, the West is called the West precisely because it was west of the caliphal domain. In other words, the West is only itself by virtue of Islam. There's also another pressing concern, and I'm talking about the intellectual context of our discussion. This has to do with demographic trends globally. Together, adherents to Islam and Christianity account for almost exactly 55% of the world population. The Judeo-Christian world became the numerically largest civilization only after the Industrial Revolution, when the children born in the 1830s onwards, in a sense, refused to die. It was those scientific progress in medical sciences that conspired, in a sense, to keep the babies alive, and in the process, the Western civilization, or the Judeo-Christian civilization, became numerically the largest world civilization, overtaking Cynic folk religion as the largest world dispensation. But from the 1870s onwards, this is a relatively short period of time in world history, and this privileged status as numerically the largest world religion, Christianity, is being now threatened by the growth rate of Islam, which has definitively beaten the generic growth rate of the world population at large, and indicates that Islam will attain parity demographically, that is, with Christianity in our lifetime. Samuel Huntington spoke about this, and he argued that parity would be reached by 2025, year 2025. But my own calculations show him to be wrong by some 12 years. By the way, I studied with Huntington at some point when he was in his last few years at the University of Harvard. So some of our methods are similar, some of our conclusions differ. So there is a question of scale and the question of democracy which sort of frame the urgency of this question. Within that, there is the question of political violence. And I have conducted a quantitative survey in which I covered the wars, civil wars, acts of democide. Democide is, of course, killing of your population by government, and structural violence, the different forms of political violence over the last 2 millennia, 2,000 years, in which I look at large-scale instantiations, 300 conflicts over 2,000 years. And this was a way of showing quantitatively who has been the most violent civilization, and it is not quantitatively Islam, although we might assume that looking at media discourses. Islam is, in fact, the second most Pacific civilization you find in world history, overtaken only by the Indic civilization or the Hindu civilization. It's not the Buddhist, it's not the Cynic, it's not the Christian, it's not the ethno-religious, or what I call the anti-theist. And I have figures on this, we've worked on a quantitative study. The death toll over these acts of political violence, over 2 millennia, is 649 million people have died in violence, acts of violence, over 2,000 years. And the Muslim share is 6% of these, which is still a sizable 32 million. But the Christian cultural sphere has seen a sizable 146 million violent deaths, so nearly 27% of the total death toll. So you can see how the West's preoccupation with the political violence of Islam can legitimately be reciprocated by Islam's concerns with the West and its political violence, purely on historical and empirical grounds, prejudices aside. Okay, I should add a disclaimer. I wanted to show you part of this study, but we don't have the slides. A admittedly, pure statistics say very little about the meaning of violence and, in our context, the meaning of terror. But if we have to quantify political violence, and we have to look for the data set, and that is what I've compiled in a previous study. Now, this should also serve as a preface to the intellectual and political context of what we are discussing, namely Islam's engagement with the political. Islam, I should start by saying, is not homogeneous, nor is political Islam monolithic. If we concede that Islam's politics is to some extent an extension of its theology, we must equally acknowledge that the many interpretative faces of Islam correspondingly lead to many manifestations of political Islam. And therefore, let me try to bring some understanding to this swamp that I refer to as political Islam. And the reason I chose the article for you to read is exactly this notion of the swamp nature of political Islam. It gives you some understanding of the heterogeneity, but I'll provide you with what I think is a better overview than in that article. And if the Chinese proverb is correct, classification is the very genesis of understanding. We can understand by classifying. And so hopefully this talk should be instructive. Now, what I wish to propose is a new taxonomy with 10 variant forms of political Islam. 3 of the forms are foundational, 3 are hybrids, 3 are derivative, that gives us 9, and 1 is reactive. And this is really a summary of hundreds of articles you would otherwise need to get through. So for that reason, I am simplifying, and I'm providing a bit of a synthesis and not the requisite detail, but it will give you a framework for understanding the remainder of this course, and indeed perhaps some ideas beyond. I will also skip subdivisions and tensions. The first category is in my taxonomy I want to term simply traditional Islam. This entails a deference to Clifford Geertz's, the Princeton anthropologist, his understanding of religion as lived experience. We're talking here about tradition, about embodied normativity. We're talking about not orthodoxy but orthopraxy, the normative praxeology, the day-to-day quotidian practices of Islamdom as a social body. But traditional Islam is not folk Islam, and I say that because Clifford Geertz focuses a lot on folk religion, because Islam has an element of scriptural tradition and it's not indefinitely malleable. There is a certain sense of canonicity. There is the Quran as a scripture, there are the narrations from the Prophet, the Hadith corpus, and then there is the juristic engagement with this by particular methods of ratiocination, so the fiqh methodology, right? So there are different aspects to traditional Islam, and we have here a marriage between the rational sciences, the aql, and the naql, the transmitted sciences, and then also, of course, what sometimes in Orientalist scholarship is referred to as Sufism or Ma'rifa, or the tasawwuf. So traditional Islam has multiplicity, even plurality, even perhaps a pluralism of understanding as embodied in the diversity of madhahib, the legal schools of thought. And underlying that is an epistemology, what I call an epistemology of uncertainty, which is to say that we know ontologically that God exists, and we know ontologically that He has a particular will, but it's difficult for us to identify the certainty. So there can be ontological certainty in the context of epistemological uncertainty, and this was really the fusion intellectually that traditional Islam made. Also, in terms of the politics of traditional Islam, it disallowed the theophanic descent, i.e. the descent of divinity into the state. It disallowed for the Holy Empire, for the divine right of kings. And Abbasid jurists, the large caliphal period under the Abbasids, which was really the formative period of Islamic jurisprudence, jurists in that period moved very decisively, including Imam al-Ghazali, of course, but many others, to make clear that the state was a requirement of the community in the pursuit of justice. It was not a requirement of religion. It was therefore a functional institution rather than a religious necessity. And this becomes very important later on when the state is upgraded to religious requirement by a form of Islamic utopianism that I'll cover. I'll be referring, of course, to the ISIS model that collapses not only the state and the caliphate, so religious authority and mundane power, but it collapses law and religion in a form of double totalitarianism. I'll cover that in a moment. So traditional Islam is a Catholic with a small c dispensation, i.e. a broad-based Kirk. We're not talking about, of course, the Christian church here. We're talking about the dispensation where the quest for divinity, godology I call it, as opposed to theology, which is a technical discipline, but the quest for God is espoused, and ideology is not really existent. This is a pre-ideological form of Islam. Fiqh, legal reasoning, speculative theology are all vehicles for living Islam, and the community itself is viewed as a Gemeinschaft, if you like, a community of creed that in principle is inspired by, not threatened by, difference. This is very different to the second base 2. So the first was base 1, and this is the second, what I call fundamentalist Islam. It is very true, of course, that many scholars have questioned this terminology of fundamentalism and argued that it is either meaningless or imprecise, for it's borrowed from a Christian intellectual heritage, and it doesn't really apply to Islam very well. I believe, nevertheless, there is a place for, in the Muslim historical experience, for this term of fundamentalism, to signify the revivalist Protestantism which emerged from the middle of the 18th century to claim exclusive jurisdiction in the definition of what is Islam, i.e. the new Islamic nomocentrism being redefined by a revivalist form of Protestantism or Calvinism, you might refer to. And of course, chief among these were the Wahhabi movement, so-called Wahhabi movement that took power in Central Arabia and via an alliance with the Saudi chieftains managed to make a new kingdom, a new united kingdom between the religious estate, the clergy, and the chieftains of the Al Saud. And that became a base for the international promulgation of a new theology, in time petro-fueled theology, to more narrowly circumscribe what it meant to be a Muslim. And of course, we are moving away from orthopraxy and plurality to orthodoxy and a narrower articulation of the canon. Though the fundamentalists were ostensibly fixated on ritual and doctrine and catechism, their selectivist reconstruction of the canon of Islam made them appear actually somewhat heterodox. The joke was that the so-called fundamentalists were in fact peripheralists, in that they took the ancillary sciences or the furu and enhanced those to be center stage, i.e. as the usul of religion. So the balance was very different relative to traditional Islam. Also, of course, there was an underlying anti-sacerdotalism, anti-clericalism in the new fundamentalist Islam. It was not led by the ulama, it was very much opposed to the whole system of investiture, of ijaza, of studying texts and being accredited in them. And ironically, this anti-sacerdotalism somewhat predates the French Revolution even. So the idea was that the problem with the Muslim condition and the problem with the Islamic faith has to do with the problem of understanding, which in turn is a problem of the correct reading of the tradition and the correct preaching of it. Hence, you can do away with the interpretative community because they are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And the only way you can do that is by positing a primacy of the text itself, the primacy of the written document, not because that literalism requires no particular training or investiture. So that's why the fundamentalist dispensation valorized the narrations from the prophets, the so-called hadith corpus, over and above legal ratiocination and exegetical kind of hermeneutics. But even in their literalism, they were very selectivist. So it was also a redefinition of what counts as scripture, because scripture was not only the Quran, it was also the hadith, but within the hadith corpus then there was a definition of a narrower circumscription of what counts as admission. This was the whole movement to go for the sahih or the authenticated hadith over and above the hasan and the da'if, although those can mutually strengthen each other. So it's a very technical debate. But the point is that not only were they scripturalist and literalist, but their selection of material became circumscribed relative to the tradition itself. So let's move on to the third foundational category. And this is no longer a representation of popular Islam. We're now moving to the elite level. And the dispensation here, or the articulation I'm thinking of, is modernist Islam. It's a late colonial tendency which saw in the onslaught of Western imperialism actually not only a political problem, but a religious problem. And they made that link, not only a political problem, but a religious problem. And they made that linkage because in their worldview of Weltanschauung, truth had to be vindicated with power. And short of that, there would have been something wrong. So what they did was to seek a redefinition of religiosity, a redefinition of what it meant to be a rigorous and adherent believer. But often courtesy of Western education, these intellectual elites distance themselves from traditional Islam in a project of rethinking and also remaking Islam in, ironically, the socio-political image of European empires. So consider, for instance, the Amir brothers in India who opened the pages of the Quran only to find the very moral codes of Victorian Britain. Or consider in the same subcontinent Sayyid Khan, who established a seminary in Lucknow to reinvent religion without metaphysics. So in this process of reform and modernization, we see how nascent Islamist conceptions grew out of a post-colonial imaginary, what I teasingly call the post-colonial stress disorder, where the traumatization of being stripped of political ascendancy and political autarky led to a reimagination of the role of religion in social life and in political life along a Western matrix. For the Muslim intellectuals, it goes without saying that this apologetic discourse, so fascinated by Western positivism and its industrial outgrowths, was not concerned with authenticity. It was concerned with parity. Okay, so I have a Freudian explanation of that, but I think perhaps we don't want to go to penile envy and so forth. And I also have a post-colonial sort of explanation of that, which revolves around Homi Bhabha's notion of mimicry, or mimesis, that the post-colonial subject or the colonialized subject, he mimics the ideational structures than the political practices of the hegemonic actor. And I think that's what happened in modernist Islam. So in the late 19th century, the first pan-Islamist protagonist, Jamaluddin Afghani, aroused the intellectuals in Cairo and in Istanbul exactly on these terms. It was a matter of geopolitical and historical survival. To remake Islam as once again a leading contender on the world scene, it had to do away with the old heuristics and the old intellectual elite and initiate a reformation of the intellectual paradigms and objectives even of the tradition. On the surface, this was a benign tendency. We were talking about urban literati that was spreading a somewhat liberal gospel to the uninitiated natives, and indeed it was a movement that was supported certainly by British imperialists. Yet what was poorly understood at the time was that doing away with the traditional scholars of religion and their accumulated scholarship, the exact safety mechanism that had disallowed the manipulation of sacred law by unscrupulous politicians was removed. And the tradition itself was now susceptible to manipulation, not only by the liberals, but also by those who shared their disdain for the classical tradition, namely the fundamentalists. And this is how the history of political Islam progresses. We find that the exact groundwork for the leap from fundamentalism to radicalism is laid by this modernist craving for political empowerment and political parity with the West at the expense of authenticity. Fundamentalism, in other words, becomes functionalism, and the means are justified by the ends. And this leads us to the fourth category, or the first hybrid category, and this I call banal Islamism. And I'm, of course, leaning on Michael Billig's contribution to nationalism studies. He proposed a neology called banal nationalism, and I therefore use this notion of banal Islamism, referring to the quotidian discourse which permeates everyday social life in the Muslim world. We're talking here about everyday political representations in any institution of socialization, be it the media, in educational systems, in the mosque, in other by governmental authorities, that invokes the ummah, the transnational or transcendental identity of the Muslim body politics, rather than a particular partisan program, because that evolution comes somewhat later. This is a very pervasive form of Islamism. It grows from traditional Islam, but it also departs from traditional Islam in being now an assertive identity. And in a sense, political Islam is all about identity. It's about identity politics. It's about more aggressive positioning of one's identity. And it's less and less about religion. At least if religion is understood, as I started with, as godology, as opposed to community affairs. So at this point, we are moving beyond Gemeinschaft, we are moving to Gesellschaft, and we find, for instance, in the intellectual evolution, Muhammad Iqbal, the India's poet philosophy from the early philosopher from the early decades of the 20th century, an early proponent of banal Islamism. He was careful to motivate political consciousness, but without the schismatics of political mobilization. So to enact a civil society awakening, but without any revolutionary agenda. Yeah, I think we can move on, given the shortest of time. The second hybrid of political Islam is what I refer to partisan Islamism. By partisan Islamism, I mean to refer to the political Islam presented by political parties which seek to capture political power in the name of Islam. And it is here we can talk specifically about Islamism. So you will notice that I've used political Islam as a broader category, and Islamism is different instantiations of political Islam. So all forms of Islamism are forms of political Islam, but not all forms of political Islams are Islamists. Okay? So this is a particular subcategory. Islamism is the claim to power, is the attempt to capture state power, is the attempt to challenge state power by the invocation of religion. And if I have to put Islamism in ideological terms, it's an amalgamation of three claims. The first claim is that the Ummah is a political community. So this is their first claim. The second is the normative that it ought to be recognized as a political community, both by Muslims themselves and by the non-Muslim adversary, because we're still talking about adversarial terms. So there are positive and normative components to these claims, and then there's a programmatic claim, namely C, that the will of this political community must be expressed in political structures. Primarily, of course, the state structures, but beyond that, in regional order and in world order. The key trope in partisan Islamism is no longer the Islamization of society or the Islamization of social morals, nor is it, as with the fundamentalists, the rectification of doctrine. It is rather the very reconstitution of the nation by the means of the state apparatus. And for that reason, this internalization of the Westphalian matrix, you see a plethora of national Islamisms. Partisan Islamism does not question the nation-state model. What they want to do is to Islamize it, and by Islamization, of course, is meant the ascent to political power. So this is ironic because, of course, the nation-state is one of the byproducts of Western colonialism in the region, but it's nevertheless internalized, which is why I call it a hybrid. You can see how it links with Muslim modernism or Islamic modernism. Partisan Islamism may be a departure even from pan-Islamism because it defines its stakes in relation to the state. Islam, moreover, is no longer operationalized as a faith system, but as an ideology. So we're seeing now the ideologization of Islam. This is the single most conspicuous feature of partisan Islamism, i.e. that it ideologizes the faith system as a third way between, historically of course, communism and capitalism, as a third way. And this is how Ayatollah Khomeini, for instance, presented his project, neither East nor West. Islam is the best. I'm just developing a jingle for you. Okay. We should say that modernity is not seen as an obstacle. In fact, Islam is adopted as a vehicle towards modernity. Islam is not a bulwark against modernization. And on the liberal end, the semi-liberal, quasi-liberal end of the spectrum, partisan Islamism can be moderate, it can be pragmatic, it can adhere to plural electoral democracy. And we found that Muslim Democrats, as you might refer to them, have made important contributions in the Muslim world for the purpose of democratization. And I'm thinking about cases in Indonesia and Malaysia primarily, and historically perhaps also in Turkey, although there has been, of course, a shift since 2016. Nowhere do we need to conflate Muslim Democrats or partisan Islamists with liberals, because they are at best illiberal Democrats or conservative Democrats, but they do not reject the use of the ballot box and the electoral system for ascendancy to power. Now the problem is, of course, that the electoral route to power has mixed results. And the paradigmatic case that discredited partisan Islamism was the case of the Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria in the early 90s, failing to obtain political power despite being victorious in elections, because there was a coup and the elections were not completed and a civil war ensued. That was a paradigmatic case from which other Islamists derive certain lessons, namely that the route to power via the ballot box was not a credible or reliable route. We saw this lesson re-invoked by ISIS when they saw what happened to the elected Morsi government, of course, in Egypt after the Arab Spring as well. But before that, of course, it was Bin Laden who drew this lesson. And that leads us to radical Islam, or radical Islamism. The end of the Cold War, which was ultimately, of course, a contest between two equally non-Islamic systems, the capitalist and the communist camp, made some Islamists step back from the national frame of reference to adopt the role of contender in the new global space of dispersion, i.e. this contest. Hence, the key referent became not the state any longer, as with partisan Islamists, it became the world order, the world system. And here, what is the key paradigmatic referent point in history is, of course, the end of the caliphate by the hands of Kemalist nationalists by Kemal Atatürk. After the First World War, and the instatement of laïcité as, ironically, a new state religion in Turkey. This was identified at the end of the caliphate as the starting point of the falling fortunes of the Muslim world. But they differ from partisan Islamism in a number of ways. Firstly, the objective. Secondly, the modus operandi. They insist that the Ummah can only be redeemed by a revolutionary strategy. In this sense, the radicals are, in a sense, Islamist Leninists. they can't wait patiently for history to fulfill itself, which was the old school structuralist approach, right? The Marxist approach. But these Muslim partisans were adopting the role of the vanguard, the religious vanguard activist who would spearhead the revolutionary paradigm change, organize the masses, and restructure the system. Still, of course, radical Islam or radical Islamism is an ideological opposition to neo-colonialism. It's not a vigilante call for violence, and hence my distinction between radical and militant. Both Maududi and Qutb, so the Indo-Pakistani ideologue and the Egyptian ideologue, both key references, link the external conditions with the internal, and this is where they borrow really from fundamentalism. What is often overlooked in contemporary discussions of radicals' rejection of the West is that in their writings, critiques of the West, in inverted commas, figure as a metaphor for Islam's own civilizational inertia, so it's externalized critiques. The West comes to signify an externalized critique of the inertia of Islam. The authority of the ulama is attacked by attacking the priesthood and the rabbinate. Ascetic Sufism is attacked by linking its practitioner to monks. And the Islamic tradition of speculative theology is attacked by attacking the reliance on reason in Western philosophy. Whereas Arab nationalism is attacked by attacking Western scientism and materialism. So there's a sleight of hand going on here in their discourses. Radical Islamists are out to kill two birds with one stone in a sense. They internalize and externalize critique. We'll have to now consider the next stage in the evolution of political Islam, and I call this permutation 1, and we are now at the 7 instantiation. The evolution of radical Islam onto militant Islamism. It was not enough to the militants to promulgate ideologically an Islamic alternative and to seek it programmatically imposed via alliances or via elections or via campaigns. Rather, unless the men and women, for that matter, of the Muslim lands took upon themselves to fight back, the imperial yoke could not be broken. If other forms of Islamism paralleled Marxism and Leninism, as I've argued, in operative principle, this in a sense was now Muslim Maoism, because power grew out of the barrel of a gun. And I've already mentioned how the Afghan jihad could show how states could be altered and empires could be challenged by the force of arms. As long as the struggle was righteous and the Muslims courageous enough, in the face of overwhelming odds, God would be watching over them. But it was not all about glory. In fact, there is a certain sense of dystopia, which I will elaborate on in a moment. A certain sense of siege, a certain narrative of victimization or persecution, which linked different geopolitical flashpoints in the Muslim world, so Palestine, Bosnia, Kosovo, Kashmir, Chechnya, Dagestan, Afghanistan, becomes all one global conspiracy to eradicate Islam and eradicate political Islam in particular. I've spoken about mimicry, and again we see it here, a sense of mimicry in radical Islam. It internalizes the Clausewitzian militarism as a leitmotif, and it wants to give non-Islam a taste of its own medicine predicated on that meta-narrative of persecution and victimization. There are subdivisions within militant Islam, of course. We know the national liberation movements in the Middle East and South Asia, you name them, Hezbollah, Hamas, Lashkar-e-Tayyiba, and a host of vigilante organizations in Kashmir. But there are also the transnational militants, and I'll focus a bit on those. For the transnational militants, we are moving conspicuously close to what I call anarcho-Islamism. The early triumphalism of having defeated the Soviets soon turned into indignation because the agenda had failed to move on. It was blocked in part by autocratic regime who disallowed the electoral or civic engagement of the alumni, the Afghan alumni, so-called, the Arabs that fought in Afghanistan, into their home countries. And there is also a lack of prospect for the partisan Islamists. As a consequence, I argue that militant Islam turns at the global level, where it's not embedded in regional context for territory or local power, becomes nihilist. It's divorced both from the mimicry of the modernists and the reconstructed Islamic normativity of the fundamentalists. So we can read this new form of anarcho-Islamism not as a revolutionary utopianism like the Iranian utopian revolutionarism or the Chinese revolution, but we are talking instead of a revolutionary dystopianism. The aim is no longer to Islamize society, to thereby gradually take over the states or the bottom-up model, nor is it to capture the state and thereby to form a new society top-down model, and both are to be found in prior instances of political Islam. The aim now, I argue, is to destroy in a final act of cosmic redemption, similar to left anarchism of the Rode Armee faction, for instance, the Red Army faction, that had espoused the dictum, don't argue, destroy. And we see this, I think, nascently in the absence of any list of demands accompanying the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the subsequent terrorist atrocities in Indonesia, in Morocco, in Pakistan, and in Turkey and elsewhere. The median, in a sense, is the message. In the new habitus of militant Islamism, there's very little that is reconstruable, there's very little that is salvageable, and only cataclysmic violence can be redemptive. Okay, I think we're okay for time, right? Yeah. Yes. Permutation 3 is what I refer to here as totalitarian Islamism. And we are now, in effect, looking at the slight divergences between the Al-Qaeda outlook, which I've termed anarcho-Islamism, to the Islamic State outlook. We are moving in this process away from transnational nihilism to a territorialized utopianism. Utopianism that seeks embedding and embodiment, and in the process seeks immanence. Immanence is the opposite of transcendence. So in a sense, at this point in intellectual history, totalitarian Islamism is arguing for Islam to be embodied in political structures, but not necessarily with the consent of people. It also wishes to reconstrue the Sharia itself, to reconstitute ethical as well as geographic boundaries. And you'll remember that the Islamic State had a lot of propaganda against the Sykes-Picot arrangement of the regional order in the Middle East, the territorially imposed boundaries by the hand of imperialist cartographers. So there's this aspect of reconstituting the geography of the region, but also to reconstitute our understanding of what it means to be a compliant and righteous Muslim. So reconstituting both ethical ideas and geographic boundaries. The remaking of history implies also an undoing of the wrongs of Western imperialism. A few ideas I jotted down on my way have to do with the globalization aspect of totalitarian Islamism. Al-Qaeda internationalized Middle East conflicts. Middle East conflicts now had international implications. But ISIS globalized recruitment. So they did not take Middle East conflicts, exported them, but they imported globally recruits to the cause of fighting Middle East forces. Also, in a sense, Al-Qaeda's religious ethics was situational. They subscribed to situational ethics, i.e. you can suspend certain norms or certain Shariatic prohibitions against, for instance, killing civilians because of the situation in which Islam found itself. So that's an instance of not nomocentrism, i.e. that the law guides your behavior, but of situational ethics. I think Islamic State went beyond that to an antinomian outlook, where the Sharia itself has to fulfill the objective of political power. And anyone who stands in the way of this project of empowerment, this project of masculinization of the post-colonial subject, is deemed not only unrighteous, as by the Al-Qaeda worldview, but a non-Muslim altogether, outside the pale. And that is where you see a much stronger articulation of takfir or anathematization or declaration of opponents being non-Muslim by the Islamic State. If you don't subscribe to the political model, you're also religiously outside the pale. But I'm saying, I actually spoke last year fully on this, so which is why I didn't quite incorporate it, but it struck me, of course, that you would probably not have been here last year, but hopefully the recording is available if you want further details. I'm actually writing a book comparing, it's called The Metaphysics of Terror, where I compare these worldviews of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. They are much more different than you would expect. And it's not simply about a leadership rivalry or a strategic or doctrinal divergence. Okay, let's move on to the good news. Right. Post-Islamism, from the dust of 9/11 and what was the utter nihilism of the perpetrators, and then the subsequent paradigm of totalitarian Islamism, emerged not only a reinforcement of banal Islamism and non-radical partisan Islamism. So all of these streams have been strengthened, but there has been a more serious corrective in the form of what I wish to call the final form of political Islam, namely post-Islamism. Post-Islamists were horrified by the trajectory of political Islam and concerned with the authenticity of the faith. It is similar to the relationship between modernity and its relationship to postmodernism. It's simultaneously a rethinking of the assumptions of what it's reacting against, in this case Islamism, and a fundamental challenge to the truth claims of Islamism. Thus, post post-Islamism, I don't think should accurately be understood as a new development or metamorphosis of Islamism. It is actually an exact inversion by the hands of those civil society organizations or preachers, scholars, mystics, communities and lay people who see themselves as heirs to and defenders of Islam's juristic and spiritual traditions. And in this case, I'm actually using the term post-Islamism very differently from Asif Bayat, who also has used this in his writings, but I think he confuses really post-Islamism with a new Islamism, which is simply a change of discourse and programmatic agenda and semantics in the partisan Islamist trajectory. So I don't think that is a complete rival paradigm. To look at post-Islamism as a genuine rival paradigm, you have to look beyond the Islamist partisan groups. Concerned about the authenticity of Islam, the post-Islamists have projected themselves as more rather than less Islamic than the Islamists, because we're no longer talking about functionalism or opportunism. We're talking about this, saving Islam from the radicals, if you like, about repositioning Islam with a human face, i.e. that approach that Gorbachev took, of course, in an ideological context, communism with a human face. We're now talking about Islam with a human face. And that can only be obtained if there is a depoliticization of Islam, that the power political projects which are sort of distorting lenses on Islam because they are politicizing and in the process distorting the message for humanity that is embedded in revelation. Islam has to be re-articulated as a sacred tradition that is utterly relevant for the human condition, but not necessarily narrow political conditions. History here is deemed to be in good hands because it's ultimately history itself is written by God, not by individual political entrepreneurs. So in this sense, post-Islamists are largely adherent to traditional Islam, but they acknowledge that a quietist engagement or non-engagement strategy with the political leaves the field wide open to the appropriation by non-traditionalists. We can therefore see post-Islamism as a revivalist form of neo-traditionalism, opposed to the opportunism of partisan Islamism and the rejectionism of radical Islam. And the clerical estate here becomes important because it's often led by traditional scholastic authorities. If they're not led by them, they're viewed with deference. So we've spoke in the train about the Minhaj al-Quran movement in Pakistan, the Gülen movement in Turkey, Abdullah bin Beya, and these kind of scholars that are simultaneously chastising radicals and militants for the ignorance of Islamic law and Islamic ethics. And at the same time, they are making themselves proponents of a kind of Muslim secularism, not because religion corrupts politics, but because politics can corrupt religion. So their concern is from the other end of the spectrum. The post-Islamists are driven by an ethos of taqwa or righteousness, and in that vein they argue that it's similar to Socrates, of course, that it's better to suffer injustice than to perpetrate it. For in perpetrating injustice, something of the soul is lost. In this mental universe or worldview of post-Islamism, the West is no longer nemesis, is no longer the antagonistic force, but it's not the source of uncritical mimicry either, right? Either in adulation or in terms of tit-for-tat militancy, is not a source of your political behavior, your relation with the West, either as a subaltern subject or as an opponent. Instead, a critical engagement is called for on the basis of what I call here homo diplomacy, and this sounds very naughty. It has to do with the diplomacy of sameness. It's predicated on an underlying humanity. Although the thought would be comforting that this is now at the ascent, I unfortunately don't see post-Islamism as taking over the discursive landscape. I think there are very good examples of this stream, of this tendency, but that other formations of political Islam are in fact allying somewhat discursively and sometimes operationally to not be challenged by the fundamental rethinking that is entailed in post-Islamism. So, by way of a quick conclusion, let me just argue that, again, political Islam is very fragmented, has a multiplicity of articulation, and for that reason you cannot analyze political Islam with a one-size-fits-all approach. Different forms of political Islam lend themselves to different forms of analysis, from pure theology over sort of anthropological engagement, Verstehen methodology, perhaps social identity theory, and social movement theory. And this would apply also to policymakers, of course, and one-size-fits-all grand strategy vis-a-vis political Islam would be very blind to the substantial ideational and contextual idiosyncrasies of the varied permutations of political Islam. And I've given you 10 on the landscape. We have not even covered regional varieties within the same paradigms, right? But in any case, I think one should caution against attempts to manipulate the internal dynamics of political Islam, because the British attempted to do that in supporting the development of modernist Islam, and as a consequence, you've opened the tradition up to manipulation, not only by the proto-liberals, but also indeed by the militants. So this attempt to manipulate the tradition often backfires, and Muslims generally resist bandwagoning on a project that is seen to be sponsored by colonial powers, or indeed new colonial powers. So any sorts of artificially inseminated process of reformation could soon become a deformation if we are not very, very careful. Thank you very much.